We're almost ready. Good afternoon. This is an interview with Zyta Eliya. Today's date is November 26, 2004, and the interview is being conducted at the Virginia Holocaust Museum by Marie Potosny. The videographer is Chuck Weitzenhofer. Mrs. Eliyahu, will you please tell us your name?
Zyta Eliya.
How do you spell that?
Zytaelyaahu.
How old are you?
73.
And when were you born?
16th of February, 1931.
Where do you live now?
Now I live in Israel, Haifa.
Okay. And how many languages do you speak?
2,
Which languages?
English and Hebrew.
Where were you living before the Holocaust began?
I was living with my family, with my parents in Czechoslovakia. We lived in Bodenbach. It's called Podmokli in Czech, and it was in the Sudeten part of Czechoslovakia, which had a large German minority, which gave Hitler the excuse to invade that part first and annex it. And we had a very happy life there, and my parents had lots of plans for the future. And then things changed, and by the middle of '38, my parents realized they wouldn't be able to stay in Czechoslovakia, and they started to make plans to go to Palestine. They even packed up in a lift many of our belongings and sent it on. They both had siblings in Palestine. And we were still there in Bodenbach, and then one night on the radio it was announced that Hitler was going to invade the Sudeten part of Czechoslovakia, and they woke me up, and in the middle of the night we took our cases and went to the railway station and ran off to Prague.
And what did you do when you got to Prague?
Well, we got to Prague, it was really difficult to find lodgings. We moved from one cramped room to another.
Mm-hmm.
And finally we more or less settled in. It was a difficult time, but eventually we settled in. I think my father managed to find some kind of work or business to do. And we were there, and then in March 1939, Prague was also invaded by the Germans. The whole of Czechoslovakia was invaded then. And the Jews there and all Europe were becoming really desperate because no one wanted to take them in. They had nowhere to go. And the situation finally came down to that the parents asked, well, at least save our children. There were a lot of people involved in bringing the 10,000 European children from Austria, Germany, and Czechoslovakia to England. A lot of pressure was put on the British government to save the children. And the two people involved in helping the Czech children, one was a young stockbroker from London, Nicholas Winton. He was made a knight for his work in saving the children. The other one was Bill Barazetti. He was from Czechoslovakia. I think he had Austrian, Swiss. I'm not quite sure of his nationality. Nicholas Winton, in '38, with a friend, went on a winter holiday to Czechoslovakia and saw what was happening with the Jews there. And when he came back to London, he got in touch with the government authorities, and he was in charge of doing all the administrative work and recruiting families, individual families who would take a child in, getting in touch with institutions and boarding schools.
Was it just you? Were you the only child of your parents at this time?
Yes, at this time I was the only child.
And before you, while you were still living in Czechoslovakia, what did your parents do for a living?
My father had an administrative job with the Jewish community in Podmokli, the town where we lived. He was also very much involved with the synagogue there. And my mother was at home.
And then, so when you moved to Prague, he had to find odd jobs.
Yes, odd jobs among the Jewish community there.
How old were you at that time?
I was 7 when we ran away to Prague. And I was 8 when I was sent to England.
When you had to leave in the middle of the night, how much of that did you understand? What was that experience like to you?
You know, they sort of said we might have to leave suddenly. I really wasn't aware of the danger. I didn't feel any fear. I was being taken care of by my parents. I felt very safe with them. I really didn't understand very much.
Was it just you and your parents? There was no extended family that left in the night?
Not that I remember, not that left the town that we lived in. Of course, once we got to Prague, we were in touch with a lot of Jewish, we were all the time in touch with the Jewish refugees that had come there from other parts of Czechoslovakia, with the Jewish people living in Prague.
When your family got connected with the Kindertransport, how did your family make that connection with them?
Well, coming back to the 2 people who helped, it was nearly 700 children they saved from Czechoslovakia. When Nicholas Winton got back to London, I think his mother helped him too. He got all the things working. Bill Barazetti was in charge of getting the children organized in groups, get them on the train, which took us across Europe to the coast and then onto a boat to England. I think what happened there was that the Jewish community there were people who were letting it be known that if you were ready to send your child to England to save it, this was the possibility. What I'm telling now deals with the Czech children that were saved. We had to send in a photograph, and my parents said, well, you're accepted. At first, when my parents told me that they want to send me to England, I didn't want to go at all. They explained it to me in this way, that they were going to try and get to Palestine. It was going to be an illegal immigration. They couldn't take, the children were not allowed, so they had to go alone. And once there, they would bring me over to Palestine. All this happened before the war started. So that's how the Jewish people got in contact with who was arranging this, and we were sent.
How did you feel about leaving your parents at that time?
Well, at first I didn't want to go at all. So they persuaded me. They said, you'll see those little princesses that you admire so much. You'll see the king and queen. You'll come to a nice house. And then they said, look, it's only for a few months, because once we get to Palestine, we're going to bring you over. So in the end, I agreed, It was, once I accepted it, that's it. Just a few days before I had to leave, my father was arrested by the Gestapo. So my mother didn't know what to do. Shall I send the child? Shall I not send the child? In the end, she asked me, she said, you decide. She said, your father's been arrested. I don't know if you'll see him. I don't know. I said, it was like I had decided to accept it, and I said, I'm going to go. Anyway, one day before, on the day that I had to leave, my father went to the officer, and he said, look, my daughter is leaving, and I have to go and say goodbye to her. So that's how my father told it, and he said, the officer just looked at him and said, just get out of the way, I don't want to see you again. And so he was released. And he came to the railway station, and my parents were both there, and I said goodbye to them. And we got on the train and we waved goodbye, and as I was waving goodbye, my mother covered her eyes, and that was the last I saw of them.
For how long?
For 8 years.
It seems like there was a lot of trust in this organization.
A lot of trust.
A lot of trust that you would be delivered to where they said they were going to take you. Or was there a lot of skepticism?
I don't know. There must have been quite a lot of organization. It must have been explained to the families that the children were going to be taken over, going to be taken care of, and it was all supervised. The supervisors could only go as far as and I think as far as the German border. Then they had to come back because they didn't want to let them go. So I think there must have been quite a lot of trust. You know, it was really a question of life or death. I mean, there was nothing left to do because there was nowhere to go, and at least they wanted to save the children. And then when I arrived in London, someone came to pick me up and took me to the family that was waiting to receive me, which was in Kent. It's about an hour's drive out of London. Came to this beautiful village, English village. It was a big house, an old one with a large garden. I always remember the contrast that everything, it was a summer's day. I went in July. Everything was so beautiful and nice, and they were so kind to me, and I was so miserable. And I started crying, and I didn't stop. I was crying for about half a year. First they tried to comfort me this way and that. They saw they couldn't do anything. They just left me to myself and got over it.
And you were just unhappy because you missed your family?
Yes, I was very unhappy about that. That was something very traumatic for all of us, for all the children, especially at my age, to be separated from your parents and to sort of expect to see them again eventually, and then you realize you're not going to see them so soon. I mean, we never thought we would never see them, but we realized it was going to be a long time, like endless time. But I was corresponding with my parents, and I even have some of those letters, and their plan didn't work out as they had planned.
How did it work out instead?
Well, first of all, until the group got organized, it was to go to Palestine. And then the boat wasn't ready, and then they were going to have another boat, and then there wasn't permission here because they went to Bratislava in Slovakia, and there they waited 9 months for the boat. In the meantime, families from Austria joined them, and from the port of Gdansk. And my mother saw that they came with children, so she was asking, well, why couldn't I have brought my child? Eventually they left, and they arrived in England at the end, they arrived in Palestine at the end of 1940. The British had been a lot of illegal immigrants coming. They took them to a camp in Atlit, which is near Haifa. They were interned there for 3 weeks. I don't think they got to see their brothers and sisters. And the hard part was that they had actually landed in Palestine and were there, and then they were put on a boat and sent to Mauritius with all the other immigrants. Mauritius is a small island in the Indian Ocean near Madagascar. It was British at the time. And I think they got there sort of beginning 41. There had been a long break. I hadn't heard from my parents for about half a year. Then we got this letter from Mauritius. And the family, wondering, where is Mauritius? I still remember they got done. It's this huge atlas, and we're looking around. It's a pinpoint island in the Indian Ocean. So then the correspondence was regular. Not all that frequent, but regular. I used to send small gifts to my parents. I knitted a pair of slippers for my mother and sent them. they couldn't write and tell me what a difficult time they were having in the camp in Mauritius, because the letters wouldn't have got out. There was censorship. It was only later, when I was reunited with them, that I heard that couples were separated. There was no family life. Men were in one part of the camp, the women were in another part of the camp, and altogether it was difficult with the food and with the health services, and I think psychologically also it was not easy. It was very hard for them there. After about 2 years, they allowed the couples to reunite and live together, and quite a lot of children were born, including my brother. Then in 1944, the men were able to join the army, the Allied army. My father joined the Czech army. It was became a unit, was part of the British army. And my brother was born, I think, about half a year before my father left. And they came to England. So I met my father in 44. Even brought me a piece of honey cake from my brother's Brit Milah. It still tasted good. And then I was meeting with my father quite a lot when they were stationed in England. And then I think the beginning of 45, they were sent to Europe. And at the end of the war in 45, the British allowed all the people who had been sent to Mauritius, they could come to Palestine, or they could go wherever else they wanted. So my mother and my little brother arrived in Palestine in 45. My father was demobbed in 46, and I joined them in 47. I actually wanted them to join me in England, because by this time I had really become an English girl. I was at high school, and I liked it there very much, and there was also Jewish communities there.
That is very interesting. I'd like to get back to the point where you become very English. But let me go back to, you were in communication with your parents, but that you were receiving censored letters, so you were under the impression the entire time that they were happy, or...
Well, you know, I knew they were somewhere safe, and I knew that one day I was going to see them again. They used to write, I was with a non-Jewish family, with an English family. And I went to school, and went to primary school. I was very happy there. I made friends. I learned English. Eventually became good in English. I was good in spelling, in composition, in reading. And my parents used to write every time the Jewish holidays came around. They would explain to me what it is, and they would tell me some of our family history. And when I first arrived in England, this family sent me to a rabbi for Bible classes with a few other children. He came from another town nearby. Eventually he stopped coming. He said he didn't have enough pupils to come. So you know, I knew I was Jewish, but I was really living like an English child, and corresponding with my parents. And actually, the family I came to was a little bit unusual, because there was an elderly gentleman. He was the master. He owned the house and the garden and everything. He was the master of the house. And there was the lady. She was his housekeeper, and she lived there with her little daughter, who was about 2 years older than me. And it was she who took me in, and she was responsible for me. And I think it was a local institution. I didn't mention this, actually. For every child entering Britain, had to have a 50 sterling pound guarantee. And it was a local institution who paid my guarantee. So she was responsible for me. And then when the gentleman died, we moved to another place to live.
What was this woman's name?
Winifred Peck.
And her daughter?
Margaret.
Margaret. And so you were very close with the two of them. It was the
Yes.
three of you then?
Everyone?
It was the three of you then?
Yes.
Okay.
After that was three of us. And after I came to Israel, they visited me many times, and of course I went back also many times.
Mm-hmm. Did she ever talk about her motivation for wanting to host someone?
Well, first of all, she didn't. Not that I can remember. First of all, she never, none of these families who took in children, they never even thought it would be for so many years. So, she was the kind of person, you need to take in a child, we'll take in a child. Because later on, when London was being bombed and they evacuated the children from London, she temporarily took in 2 more children. So maybe she wanted a playmate for her daughter. She was her only daughter. I think she just did it wanted to help. She was a very good person, and a very decent person, and a very straight. And she did a lot of good things, and I think she just did it like that. But later on, after I'd been there some time, the Jewish communities were thinking maybe to take all the Jewish children out of non-Jewish families. And I remember I didn't want to leave them because I had settled down and felt cared for and felt very comfortable there. And I remember they even went and I was allowed to stay with them. But there were many who stayed with non-Jewish families.
It sounds like they were sensitive at first to your being Jewish, that they tried to connect you with the Jewish community.
Yes, they did. But then, there were no Jews around. And I was happy at school, and so they just let it at that. And anyway, I was in contact with my parents, so they left it at that.
How did you learn English? That must have been very hard when you first went over.
Well, just to sidetrack, we have that experience in Israel. The children go to school and they pick it up. At first they use sign language with their hands and they say 1 or 2 words, and children pick up a language quickly. I just learned it going to school and being with the family, and they always corrected my English. And I started reading books, and I heard no other language, because I spoke Czech and German, and I forgot both those languages. Just one word remained with me in Czech. It's počkej. It means wait. Because the little girl was always running away from me. I had this big garden, she was running around, and I said, počkej, počkej. So that was all that I remembered. And then the war started in earnest. The children were coming. Britain would have taken in more than 10,000 children. But when the war started on the 1st of September, all these transportations were stopped, and quite a lot of children got left behind.
I understand after 1939 they stopped taking in children because it just became too difficult and too dangerous to transport.
It wasn't that they stopped taking it, it was that Germany stopped allowing them to be sent out because they invaded Czechoslovakia, all of it. So, and Austria and Germany, well, they were at war. First of all, they were at war with Britain. So there was no diplomatic contact anymore. And that was the reason why they couldn't come out anymore. But they would have taken more children.
How did you feel the effects of the war where you were in England?
How did I feel the Well, I'm sometimes surprised, but I really didn't seem to be very aware of it until the bombing started, when the Battle of Britain started. And then we didn't really suffer from the bombing, but the planes would go over our area on the way to London. If they didn't drop all their bombs there, they would drop 1 or 2 on the way back. Well, at school we had to go down the shelters, we had to continue studying there. There was blackout. Sometimes we saw pilots parachuting. And yes, my foster mother, I called her Tante, which means auntie in German. She wanted me to call her mother, but I couldn't. And she would tell me what was happening and how terrible it was and everything. You know, you knew it, I don't know, as a child I knew it was there and I would hear about it, but I didn't read newspapers. The only time I really started coming in contact was many years later. I think it was already maybe in 45 when we saw pictures of what the Germans had done in Europe, the concentration camps, because we didn't know anything about that.
And you were a teenager at that time when you would start seeing pictures and understanding.
Yes, I'm 45, I was 14. And then we became aware of what had been happening. But I didn't get into it like I get into things now, or even earlier.
When your father came in 44 to England, and
Yes.
he joined the military service?
Well, he joined from Mauritius.
Mm-hmm.
They were recruited, and then I don't know where they got their training, but they came as a unit to England. They were part of the British Army.
So how did you, when you met him for the first time after so many years being away, what was that like?
Well, it was difficult. Altogether, my meeting with my father was difficult. You know, I didn't know how to react. I didn't know, what to do. I just didn't know what to do. And even when in 47, when I joined my parents in Palestine, well, I was sort of maybe more prepared for it by then, but it was very difficult to bond with them. And it took many, many years to bond with them again. And when we started having the reunions in Israel, it was actually 50 years after 39, and people were sending in their stories and we were discussing it, we found out that the younger the children, the more difficult the bonding when they reunited with their parents. The older children from 12 years upwards, it was easier for them to bond. You know, my father, he was always optimistic or pragmatic. And he thought, well, this is my daughter, this is how it is, and that's it. My mother, she realized she had left an 8-year-old child and was getting back a 60-year-old. But somewhere she thought emotionally the relationship would continue where it left off when I was 8. But of course, that couldn't be. So it was hard for both of us. But as I say, eventually we got to meet each other.
Mm-hmm.
We got close again, especially the last 15 years.
And you had also, you said, become quite English. You'd become an English teenager, you were doing English things.
Yes.
And you wanted your family to move to England,
Yes.
not go to Palestine.
Yes.
And that probably hit their ears in a very abrupt way.
Well, you know, my father he would have done it. After the war finished in 45 and he was still in Europe, he went back to the town where we had lived. He was sort of thinking, maybe we could go back to Czechoslovakia, because Czechoslovakia was a wonderful country. It was very developed, it was democratic, it was complete liberalism there, it was good for the Jews. So he went back to visit the town, and he went back to the building and met some of the neighbors, and they said, "What, you're still alive? We thought you were dead with all the others." So that was the end of that. But I think we had some relatives in South Africa. He thought maybe there. And maybe he would have come, and he would have had the right to come to England because he had been part of the army. But my mother said no, she's had enough of wandering. She wants to stay, she wants to be in Palestine. She had sisters and brothers, and so did my father. And so we stayed there.
Mm-hmm. I imagine one of the things reconnecting with your family was that you now had a brother. What was that like?
Well, you know, as a child in Czechoslovakia, I'd always wanted another brother or sister. He's 13 years younger than I am. So when I arrived, it was nice, he was cute, lovely little child, 2.5 years old. I couldn't speak with him because he spoke Hebrew, I spoke English. And I accepted it. So,
That's just how it was.
I beg your pardon?
That's just how it was.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's how it was.
So what was it like when you moved to Palestine?
Well, as I said, I had wanted we would be in England, but once I arrived in Palestine, I really fell in love with the country. You know, I said, oh, this is Jewish, and that's Jewish, and the policeman is Jewish, and I really was very happy to be in Palestine once I got there.
How do you feel about your experience in the war and the Holocaust being different from your family's? Was that something that you had ever had to bridge between them?
You mean between my parents and myself? Actually, we both suffered in the same way, I think. I mean, they suffered more because they were interned in Mauritius, and they landed in Palestine. They were taken, put on a boat and sent off. You see, actually, what happened was that I had it good in England. I mean, I was taken care of. I had a good life, good everyday life. We did bridge it. What was difficult was the emotional.
Yeah.
I had to stop this and then
Okay.
this thing just went blank on me.
Okay. We'll stop and
Let me
take a break.
get chatting.
Okay. Sorry. How do you spell the name Mauritius?
Mauritius.
Mauritius. How does that spell?
Mauritius.
Okay.
Mauritius.
And that was a British.
Mauritius.
Okay, we're back. Well, you were telling me about Mauritius. Is that how to say it?
Mauritius.
Mauritius.
Yes.
Okay. And you said that there was an interesting side story about that came out of the war. People who.
Yes. I don't remember the number. I do have that information at home. Well, it's interesting because, you know, in a way they were saved, although they had reached Palestine. It could have been saved there. But they were there and not in Europe. But it was a lot of emotional suffering for the people who were sent to Mauritius. And you asked me about how did we bridge, my parents and myself. I wasn't suffering physically. And a child, you know, adapts itself. So it knows it's in this place, its parents are there, they're going to meet one day. But for my parents, the difference really was emotionally. They suffered much more emotionally, I think, than I did. I suffered very much at the beginning, but when a child has no choice and it's being treated well and taken care of, it settles down, accepts what it has.
And your host mother said that she would have liked you to call her mother.
Yes.
But you never did.
Oh, I said I can't.
Why was that?
Because I had my own mother. And she said she didn't want me to call her aunt because she was a young person. So she said, well, how do you say aunt in German? I said, Tante. I said, all right, call her Tante. And to this day, if I refer to her, if I talk with her daughter, I always say Tante.
How was it to leave your host family?
Oh,
Was it difficult to leave your host family after all those years together?
Yes. You know, as I got older, as a teenager, I think I had my problems, and it was difficult to leave them, and it was difficult to leave England. It was difficult to leave the school. Actually, I was at grammar school, high school. I had friends. It was difficult to leave the whole life in England.
Well, if you've not already shared your most vivid memory, what would that be in your mind of your experience?
Of my experience here. I think when I arrived in England at their house, and it was this beautiful summer day, and I felt so miserable. I think that's my most vivid memory.
Mm-hmm.
That's when I really felt the trauma of having separated from my parents. And although I was reunited with my parents, spent most of my life with my parents, and shared all the things with them. My mother lived till 88 and my father till 92. So I had many years with them, and there was a lot of affection between us. I still can feel and sense the trauma of that moment.
Of arriving, and you should have been happy. It was a beautiful day, you know, and
Yeah, I should.
yeah, it was so traumatic.
Yes, because I suppose it really got to me that you left your parents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm. How do you answer people who say the Holocaust never happened? Do you ever have to confront that?
I've never heard that said by somebody. I've read about it quite a lot, and there was this court case, I think with an American, I don't know if he was a writer. There was someone in England who wrote a book about it, and she confronted him, and he was taken to court, and she won. Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know. I think it's just terrible. I mean, even the Germans have accepted it and have done a lot about it and continue to do a lot about it. Now you have this Holocaust museum in Berlin. I don't understand how anybody can say that. I think they're just out of their mind.
Well, are there other things that you would like to share with us, or things that you've written down that...
So I was just looking. Just one thing I'd like to add. About 3 years ago, I went with my friend to Prague. We went on a visit, a few days in Prague. And I said to him, you know, we must go back to my hometown. Just want to see if it's real. Because when I first left my parents, when I first came to England, I was remembering where we lived, and I was remembering the synagogue. And when we got to Prague, we were visiting Prague, and then we found a Czech driver who knew English, and we told him the name of the town, Podmokli. Trouble was, so many places had the name of Podmokli. There were villages, there were areas, but eventually found it. I knew it was quite near to the German border, south of Dresden. So we set out. It was a 2-hour drive. We got to Podmokli, and we found the street. And I think, I don't know if I mentioned it already, we found the street and we found the building. And it was exactly the same as I had left it. There was this big empty plot next to our building. The only thing they had done was pave it over and use it as a parking lot. The building was very drab looking. The entrance to the building, the door was sort of swinging, but it was all the same. Then our Czech driver asked a lady where the synagogue was, and she said it's just a few 100 meters along. And she said, but you know, it's closed because they don't use it anymore. Well, we went and we found it, and it was there exactly as I'd left it. It had been painted a sandy yellow. It was in very good condition, and I could see it was being kept up very well. We couldn't go inside. It was just a few hours that we were there. But it had the Magen David above the entrance, and it was there.
It's amazing that it survived through all that war.
I know. I also wondered, and it's not being used as anything. I hope it won't be.
I hope so too.
So it really was a nice feeling to go and see the synagogue.
Well, thank you for taking the time to share with us.
You're welcome.
On behalf of the Virginia Holocaust Museum, I thank you, and on behalf of myself, I thank you. And
thank you.
I've enjoyed this.
Yes.